Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the race to become our state's next governor grows more crowded as potential candidates officially launch their campaigns and try to raise big dollars. Utah's leaders in Congress play an important role as impeachment proceedings go public. And the Supreme Court considers the legal status of dreamers, an issue that hits close to home for Utahns.
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Damon Cann, associate professor at Utah State University, Kate Bradshaw, director of government affairs at Holland & Hart, and Matt Canham, managing editor for the Salt Lake Tribune. So glad to have you all with us. We're going to start talking about elections, but we have two newly elected officials here on the Hinckley Report today. Damon, mayor of North Logan City, just elected. Yes. And of course, Kate, just elected also as Bountiful City Council.
Thank you.
Glad to have you both. I guess we're the two non-elected folks. So let's talk about some that are trying to get elected. How about that?
Let's do it.
Because your story was the first one I read, Matt. We have a new entrant, a new candidate for governor for the state of Utah. Talk about this, Governor Jon Huntsman, former governor and ambassador. What does this do to this race with him saying he's going to jump in?
It's huge. I mean, I think one thing you got to think about is this is a man who's already won statewide twice, and he did it by pretty significant margins, not just in the primaries with Republicans, but in the general election, it was obviously a landslide. He's the only candidate that's going to be in this race who's actually won statewide before. You add that on to being part of a prominent family, long public history of public service, as well as this universal name ID. He is the Goliath that Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox identified him as yesterday. I think some people can say whether, can challenge the Lieutenant Governor, who's also a prominent candidate, of whether he's actually David or not. He's a pretty prominent person too. But it's undeniable that Jon Huntsman just drastically changes the landscape of this race.
Okay, so it's interesting because Lieutenant Governor did immediately send out a tweet of a picture of David and Goliath. Is that what this one is? Is that kind of story?
I don't know that I would say it's David and Goliath. Jon Huntsman obviously has this, storied past, as Matt just listed. But, Spencer Cox has been out on the campaign trail. He's been out visiting cities, doing a tour. He released a list of mayors that have endorsed him.
125 mayors have endorsed him.
He's been in my city. My mayor was on that list as well. So, I don't know that it's David and Goliath, but there is definitely going to be an interesting matchup going forward, let alone all the others that have also hinted therein or formally declared.
Mm-hmm. So Damon, give us a sense of the why here. I mean, that seems to be a question people are talking about with Jon Huntsman. From what you've been reading and the people you're talking to, why has he decided to jump in, do you think? What does he hope to accomplish?
I think that's something that hasn't been entirely clear at this point as to exactly what Huntsman's motivations have been. And I think one of the keys for him to be able to be successful in this race is to do a good job of articulating to Utahns why it is that he is coming back and seeking this office again.
Yeah, what kind of assurances do you think he can give? Because that does seem to be the question.
And Spencer Cox, again, one of his quick replies was, I promise that if I do this, I will serve the full term out, won't leave for anything else, not a stepping stone. That's some of the language we saw from the Cox campaign. And I think that Huntsman probably needs to do some things like that to assure Utahns that he's here for this office and here to stay.
What the former governor told the reporters at the Salt Lake Tribune is that he has done international service. He has been involved in politics broadly. He's seen what it is, and he's ready to downshift back to the state, something where he can have more tangible impacts on issues that are important to an area that he cares about. That's the line he's going to push. It's interesting, though, that what you pointed out, I think, will be one of these crux of the race, is Governor Huntsman's experience as an ambassador and leaving his last term as governor to be the ambassador to China a negative or a positive. You have Spencer Cox, who's going to say he's a guy who's using this as a stepping stone. He's going to leave again. The governor's response to that is to be a good governor in today's day and age, you have to have connections internationally. You have to be competitive nationally and internationally. And who's better suited to do that than me? I do think that one debate will be a really interesting line to track through this whole election. I also just want to point out before I forget that I should always mention that Paul Huntsman is the owner and publisher of the Salt Lake Tribune, and he is Governor Huntsman's brother.
Okay. Kate, let's talk about a couple of those points that just came up, whether this is a plus or a minus, because what you mentioned was correct. The lieutenant governor said, I'm never going to leave if I'm in this role, and I'm only going to run for 2 terms. Clearly, that's the counter to some of these comments about Governor Huntsman. Tell us how that plays, a plus or minus.
Well, the interesting thing is, they're making these comments now, but their first audience is likely going to be delegates, and then maybe a full Republican primary. So it's interesting, in as we all absorb it now as Utahns across the spectrum, how that weighs for you. But if you're a delegate, I think that's a little bit different, and I think the delegates will be thinking a little bit more about issues that are less international and a little bit closer to home.
Okay, so how do you play the delegate game? Because that's going to be so interesting, because that's not the only way to get on the ballot now as a Republican, right?
No, there's two different ways that you can get on the ballot. You can pursue a signature gathering path, you can pursue a caucus convention path, or you can do both paths. I would be willing to bet that most of the campaigns, most of those that have declared or are thinking about declaring, will probably pick the dual path. If you're a serious candidate, I don't know why you wouldn't pick both. I'm both a county and a state delegate for the Republican Party. I don't necessarily have a hang-up with candidates that pick a dual path, although I might be in the minority of delegates.
But what would you think as a delegate, or maybe some of the people you're with, if someone just bypassed entirely? If you have John Huntsman, for example, says, I'm just going to get signatures and go. Would the delegates... What would they say about that?
The delegates will absolutely make a point of raising that as an issue, that he wants to be the Republican nominee but did not come through the caucus convention system. Now, delegates are a small group, so having a small group but also a very active and loyal group constantly message against you could be a factor of why you'd, even though sometimes that's painful, go the dual path.
And he has said he's going the dual path. We asked him that question because it has been such an issue in our electoral system. And the governor said that he is going to collect signatures, and he will be at convention.
Okay, so, maybe just talk about that for just a moment there. Do you see that every candidate, I'm going to talk about some that haven't been announced yet in just a moment, do they all do both paths, even if they have a chance of losing there at convention?
That's a great question. And as I look at it, some of the candidates that are not yet announced, I think, have their best base with the delegates. Greg Hughes has a $500,000 in the bank that he's raised for this race, and he's a much more natural candidate to appeal to the state delegates than either Huntsman or Cox. And so I think the goal for candidates in the mold of Huntsman or Cox is make it through the caucus convention phase without raising too much kerfuffle with some of those core partisans, and then be ready to make their case to a more moderate general Republican audience across the state.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about a couple of those. So you mentioned Greg Hughes. The panel, do you think Greg Hughes is in?
Yes.
I think you wouldn't raise money like that if you wasn't.
So he's the $500,000 not to run for governor. That would be weird. And, the former House Speaker is formidable. And I actually think has a unique difference between, if you compare him to Cox or to Huntsman, is he is a 100% Trump supporter. He is going to bear hug the president in a way that Cox and Huntsman definitely will not. And I think the primary in this election is going to be so fascinating. If you have 5, 6 candidates on the ballot, none of these people are going to get a majority. You're going to win with a sliver of the electorate. And so what path you take, it could really change this race.
Well, let's talk about that, because what we would call that is a plurality issue.
Yes.
So you have that with Greg Hughes. Kate, what about Thomas Wright? Because it's another one that may pull from the farther right end of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, Thomas has served for a long time as the Utah Republican Party National Committeeman. He's worked long in politics. He was a very successful county party chair before he was a state party chairman, too. So he knows the delegates. He has spent a lot of time with delegates. He would likely fare well with delegates, but he's also not without resources, and I imagine he would also signature gather as well.
A couple other candidates. Let's talk about those that have announced a little bit, Damon, and a little bit of their path forward. So we have Jeff Birmingham, who a businessman, an investor, does a lot in the IT industry, really trying to get out around the state too. What is his path?
I think Birmingham probably, like the other candidates, has to pursue both paths. At this point, the race with so many people, so many of the other candidates gathering signatures, I think anyone who doesn't make an effort in that direction, unless they've really got a clear path with the delegates to the primary election, if you want to be relevant in this election, you have to gather the signatures.
Amy Winder-Newton?
Exactly the same thing. I mean, I think both with Amy Winder-Newton and with Birmingham, the fight is, and with some of the other candidates like Wright and Hughes, it's about name ID. When you have Huntsman and Cox that are just better known, the first fight is just for people to know your name. That's why we see Birmingham going up with radio ads this week. And I think Amy Winder-Newton is known in Salt Lake County, where she serves on the Salt Lake County Council. But this is a statewide office. She needs to introduce herself and make her name known, and throughout the population centers, and then start working through the rural counties. I think that there's a lot of work there, which actually just dovetails with what you talked about with the delegate process. Those are very interested Republicans who are involved. It's a natural place to start building your name. So why wouldn't you start there when you're trying to just get people to know who you are?
We better talk to us two more in case I'm missing anyone else. Rob Bishop, Spencer Eccles. Those also names we're hearing. Likelihood of them jumping into this race?
I think there's a very good chance that we see at least one, if not both of them, get into the race. Again, one of the exciting things I think for Utahns about this is to see the wealth of political talent that we have coming into the race. But it's going to be a tough decision. But we have a lot of attention, a lot of saber rattling from those two. And you just don't do those kinds of things if you're not looking to get into the race.
Just before we leave it, any names out there you're hearing for the Democrats that are going to be jumping in right now?
They've been oddly kind of silent to a large extent.
But I think that's a great strategy, though, because right now, Huntsman announces, the news is going to be all about Huntsman's announcement. In fact, I think part of the reason why some of these others haven't announced is because that can take the wind out of their sails. Even today, tomorrow, next week, if someone announces, right now the news is all about how populating the Republican field. I suspect that there are several Democrats out there getting ready, but let the news cycle of who the Republican nominees are work its way out, and then you can have your own moment when time comes to announce for a Democrat that you're serious about getting in.
It means I have to ask then, how long do these other candidates need to wait after the announcement that happened yesterday?
Well,
2 weeks, 3 weeks?
You got to do it.
Yeah.
You got to do it in the next couple of weeks. The conventions are in March?
Yeah, the conventions are coming up. Plus, you're entering the holiday season.
Yes.
The closer you get to Thanksgiving, the closer you get to Christmas. The public's focus, you turn toward family, you turn to those holiday events, and it's just a hard time to get the attention. We'll also enter our legislative cycle. That will draw a certain amount of attention away. We may have a special session. That will draw attention away. And so finding your window is going to be tricky in the last quarter of the year.
It's going to be interesting to watch.
It is. It's going to be a great race.
Let's talk about another family event. Impeachment proceedings. Okay, so Matt, I know that you've been watching these closely. What new turns have taken now that officially today is the second full day of testimony?
Right. It's interesting. This thing, even though it's moving at a very fast pace for Congress, for people who've watched it, it is expected, right? These were testimony of people who already gave 10-hour depositions in a private session. Those depositions have then been released, so we've read what they're going to say. So you're looking at these small changes. It's all about public perception. And as someone who's not in Washington and is not in the middle of it, it does feel a little bit like we're just playing out what is expected with an outcome that we all kind of know what's going to happen.
It's kind of bad theater, isn't it?
It's like
you need to memorize that script.
And so you're going to have the Democrats trying to use this to bolster a case that they think that there's something worth impeaching the president on. And you have Republicans trying to say, is this really as bad as they're saying it is? I don't think it's as bad as they're saying it is. And then it's probably going to be a party line vote for impeachment. And the real process will be in the Senate. Right now, this House is playing out these public hearings. There could be a dozen of these in the next week or so, 2 weeks. and then it goes to the Judiciary Committee, then it goes to the floor of the House. They're hoping they can finish this by the end of the year. Congress is never, ever good at hitting a deadline, so we'll see how that goes. But while I think it's interesting, sometimes as people who are political junkies in the theater part of it, I don't know how new it is.
Okay, Damon, tell us about this. Is this really just the dance right now with the kind of outcome that's almost certain, at least in the House? And how are Utahns feeling about it?
So I would read it in that way. We've been watching Trump supporters and Trump detractors work through different issues and events for over 4 years now, stemming back to during the course of the Trump campaign. And at the end of the day, the pattern we observe is people who supported him before support him still, people who opposed him before oppose him still. And it's hard for me to imagine, based on what we've seen so far, a lot of minds being changed. Utah's an interesting place when it comes to Trump, though. I'm interested to see, especially if there is a place you might expect a little bit of movement, I would think it would be here. It's hard to figure out how to be popular as a Republican in Utah now, and it's because of Trump. You watch, Mitt Romney is very strident in his criticisms, and he's underwater. Chris Stewart is very strident in his praise of Trump, and he's struggling with his popularity, and it's really made things hard, and will continue to be in this election cycle under the shadow of impeachment for Republicans in Utah to know which way to go on this issue.
Interesting. Talk about Chris Stewart for a second, since you brought that up, because he's been more vocal this week, and our only member that's actually on the National Security Committee right now. That's looking at this.
Yeah, so far he's saying that, even going as far as calling this a coup, and has been shifted from, during the campaign, throwing a few criticisms in the direction of the president to being one of his strongest advocates in Congress. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out with his constituency.
Yeah. Do you think Utah voters, is it still split on?
It's a division, and I just don't know where to draw that line. These guys are really smart, though.
Chris
They
Stewart
know.
has decided where he's drawing the line. He is a Trump supporter. It's going to be announced today that he's co-chairing Trump's campaign here in Utah, while sitting on the impeachment hearing. So we're not really wondering where Chris Stewart's vote's going to go on this one. He's drawn a hard line. He's defending the president, not just in these hearings, but on cable TV with regularity. He's, read some of these transcripts, and he's come up to the conclusion what the president did is not impeachable. So that's where I think the House is pretty wired. We've seen the votes to start this impeachment inquiry. They were very party line. It would have to be I don't even know what kind of bombshell it would have to be for someone to change their vote, just because of the pattern we've seen with this president in particular.
Interesting. Kate, I want to switch gears to what's happening locally. You've been involved heavily in the tax reform debate that's been going on, representing some clients as well. But we talked about it in the program. We need to know what's happened since, over this last week. What's the current developments?
I think Governor Herbert said it best when we were having extra innings of tax in session this summer. That's what we've done. So the legislature has been engaged in a tax task force all summer. And they finally have finished their listening tour. They've been back to deliberating and studying different topics that they feel will help with what they think is a structural imbalance. Too much money in our income tax silo that we've set up via our state constitution, not enough in our general fund. They have now released, the task force has now released a draft bill. It includes a lowering of the income tax. It includes an expansion to a small number of services. It does include putting the sales tax back on food, the full sales tax back on food, with some offsets for a grocery tax credit. There are some targeted income tax reductions to increase the child deduction, to do an intergenerational poverty tax credit, and also to not tax Social Security income. So it's pretty wide and sweeping as the proposal sits today.
Mm-hmm. Damon, I would break out a couple of those pieces. One, just because it has even ties to our first conversation today with John Huntsman, restoring the sales tax on food. Is this a potential wedge issue even in this race for governor?
I think this could become a very big issue, because that was one of Huntsman's signature moves in the course of his governorship. and it seems to be one that has been fairly popular. It'll be interesting to see how Spencer Cox and the Herbert administration and other candidates approach the tax reform question with a signature Huntsman issue on the agenda.
With all these issues surrounding it, I'm kind of curious right now, why now? And maybe you're going to have some comments about that, Kate, because this is not an easy thing they're trying to do, and there's still great controversy even just about that point.
When I speak with legislators, they say they're genuinely concerned about the welfare of the state's budget. What other underlying issues might be there? I trust Kate to weigh in on.
Yeah. The interesting part is there is some, I think, divide between the House and the Senate. The House is very much led out on this issue. The governor's office, to a certain extent, has as well. It was included in Governor Herbert's 2019 budget to do tax reform and an expansion to services. But the House has been very much the driving part of this. And I think it is Speaker Wilson's deeply held belief that there is a structural imbalance. And across his legislative career, he's always worked on budgetary issues, long-term planning issues. He came into office at the depth of the recession, and I think that does kind of give the underlying color commentary to why he feels so strongly about structural issues within our finances.
Since you're kind of in those rooms where they're talking about right now, is there any consensus between the House and the Senate? Because word on the street is maybe they're not quite together on this one.
It's interesting because, the House, in working with former Governor Huntsman, was the driver to take the sales tax off of food. The Senate has a number of times toyed with the idea of putting the sales tax back on food. That's seen as being something in the current draft proposal that's out there that was kind of a give to the Senate. We'll put the sales tax back on food. The expansion to services, that's sort of something the House wants, and that's where that is, although the list is much whittled down from where it was proposed during the session.
Okay. Just one more point on this one, Matt.
Yes.
We still have not resolved sort of what's going to happen with education.
Right.
All right. Describe what's happened there and where you see that one going.
So this is such a complicated bill. When you talk about the sweeping nature of all tax policy, well, you talked about the silo for income tax. That income tax goes to education. And there are lawmakers and legislative leaders who think that should be removed. There should be ability to use that surplus in income tax in a variety of ways around state government. Obviously, people in the education community are not thrilled with that idea of losing that guaranteed funding in a system that they think is still underfunded. So that debate is like it's overarching. It hangs over all the tax reform part. But it won't be decided by this tax reform bill because that's a constitutional requirement. You got to go to voters to remove that. So that's going to hang over all of it, but it's not necessarily right in this legislation itself.
Well, I have a couple for you, Damon, but Kate, what are they saying they're going to do if the tax plan is built around this earmark that they put to the voters, and what if the voters say no? Does the whole thing, the House of Cards, fall down?
It does create a very serious problem if they build a tax reform package that is contingent on being able to move some of the siloed funds back into one general state checking account, and the voters say no. We'd probably have to go into a special session to probably, tweak some things. Right. A lot of the discussions right now seem to hinge on, because public education shares that siloed funds with higher education, of perhaps setting a floor. We're the only state that does it exactly this way. Other states designate a percentage of a certain type of tax to education, and that's where the discussions seem to be having right now with the education community is, can we guarantee you a certain floor we will never drop below in a commitment? And if I were in public education, I would be saying, let's put that in a constitutional amendment and make it a little harder to never drop below that floor if that's where it goes.
Lots of options on that one. We'll follow that one closely. Damon, I want to get to an issue that happened on a national stage with very local implications. The United States Supreme Court heard a case on DACA, on the people that have this designation, the Dreamers, as we call them. What was the case about?
DACA, Deferred Action Against Childhood Arrivals, is a program that allows children who were brought here in their youth to be able to stay here. They came here arguably not through choice of their own, but were brought here by their parents. And it was enacted by executive action only during the course of the Obama administration. And this has been something of a target during the course of the Trump administration, Trump wanting to roll back. And this is one of the challenges. When you go an administrative strategy than working through Congress, another president can come back, and just as easily as one president waves the wand and makes it happen, and the next president can make it go away.
Mm-hmm. So a good explanation. So Utah is maybe a little bit different than what you might get in other parts of the country on this particular issue. Why is it? We have 10,500 of these students and others inside the state of Utah with this designation.
Sure, and so Utah's a really unique place to talk about this because there are a number of things that make Utah Republicans different from Republicans nationally, and one of them is attitudes about immigration. We send a lot of people on missions for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out to other parts of the world. They come back here. They have this strong affinity for people in the countries where they've served, as well as Utah being a global marketplace increasingly. And you combine those things together, and it shapes Utahns' attitudes about immigration in different ways to where this is a program that Utahns are more likely to support relative to Republicans elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. You know, we also have this interesting history of our pioneer ancestors or settlers of our state being religious refugees and coming to a place so they could find safety. And because of our religious influences and because of the missionaries that have been sent out across the globe and have brought the Mormon faith worldwide, a lot of people have then done second waves of migration to Utah. In my family, I have pioneer ancestors that came in handcarts, and I have pioneering ancestors that came much more recently, through Ellis Island. And that kind of understanding of those family stories of struggle, I think places us in a different spot for a new generation that feels like they were fleeing different types of adversity and wanting to achieve the dream we have here in Utah and in the United States.
Okay. It's going to have to be the last word, but we'll watch this court case very closely. Well, thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. The show is also available as a podcast on kued.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.